The American Congressional Exchange is a program that we have that BPC started where we bring two members together, a Republican and a Democrat from two very different parts of the country, and we have them visit each individual's districts and really get to know not only that member, but also that district.
Now, up until that trip, I did not know David Trone. And because of his willingness to make the trip, to come out, to spend that time with me, I can testify that I now have a friend and an ally on many issues of mutual concern.
Many of us share the same principles, and we bring to the table different life experiences, different political perspectives. We shouldn't find that dangerous or divisive. We should find it something to celebrate.
This is how America works, is by coming together, rolling up our sleeves, getting away from the partisanship, getting away from the rhetoric, and getting back to just delivering.
When you have a conversation with people and you laugh and you get to know them, you no longer see them in the same light, and you're much more willing to say, let's figure out how we can be friends and really find solutions. It creates a different type of dialogue and friendship that exists, and it also allows those members to see how different parts of the country are and how many similarities there are.
Hello, and thank you for joining us today here at BPC's J. Ronald Terwilliger Center for Housing Policy. I'm Owen Minot, a Senior Policy Analyst here at BPC. Today, we'll be discussing accessory dwelling units. ADUs, also known as granny flats, are smaller and more affordable housing units located on the same lot as a single-family home. They can be a standalone structure or attached to a home or a garage. While ADUs have been illegal across much of the country, there have been recent successful efforts to legalize them in places ranging from California to Utah. However, even where ADUs are legal, they remain expensive to construct, and there are inadequate financing options available, which limit their expansion and development. In our discussion today, we're going to highlight the potential ADUs have to provide affordable housing options and support homeowners, and dig into the key barriers to financing and constructing ADUs in those places where they are legal. Just to give you an outline of our programming today, first, we're going to have a brief presentation to provide you with some important context for this topic, followed by a panel discussion to explore these issues in more depth. If you're watching live today, please submit any questions you have at any time, and you can post those in the chat if you're watching on YouTube. And now let me introduce our presenter. David Garcia is the Policy Director at the Turner Center for Housing Innovation at UC Berkeley. He leads the center's engagement in local, state, and federal housing policy and supports the center's research-driven policy recommendations. Prior to joining the Turner Center, David was the COO for 10 Space, a real estate development company in Stockton, California. And with that, David, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Owen, and thanks for having me today. So again, my name is David Garcia. I'm the Policy Director at the Turner Center at UC Berkeley. If you're not familiar with the center, we focus on really all manners of housing, from the cost of construction to land use, and also to innovations in the housing and home building construction space. But today, I'm going to talk through some of our work around accessory dwelling units. This is an issue that we've been really engaged with here, specifically in California, as the state has been somewhat of a leader in passing reforms to catalyze more ADU growth in the state here. So we can go to the next slide. So starting in 2016, the California legislature has passed a series of laws to help facilitate greater ADU growth. Now, this includes laws that not only just simply made it legal to build ADUs in California, but also dictated design standards like height and setbacks, size, and capped impact fees, things like that. And as you can see from this chart, combination of all of those policy changes has resulted in a really significant explosion of ADU growth in California. If you look at 2016, ADUs really made up a really pretty insignificant amount of the overall number of homes being built in California. Then you look at what's being built more recently, and today ADUs make up about 1/5 of all new permits pulled in the state of California. And so the combination of those reforms I described earlier have really made a huge difference in creating new supply of ADUs in the state. If you can go to the next slide. And so here's just a little bit about some of our work around ADUs and what what do they look like? When we talk about an ADU, it could mean a lot of things. And based on the work that we have done in collaboration with our partners at the Center for Community Innovation, also at UC Berkeley, is we found that ADUs in general, they're actually less expensive to build than other forms of new housing, particularly in California. They can cost between $200,000 to $300,000 to construct new from the ground up. It could be less if it's something like a garage conversion. This compares really favorably to how much it costs to build regular market rate housing in California, as well as deed restricted affordable housing, which can sometimes cost more than $1 million per unit. And so in comparison, ADUs actually are a much more affordable option to build. We also know that they are generally mostly rented on the open market. This is a question we get a lot is, how do we know that people building these things in their backyards are actually renting them out? Or are they just, exaggerated extra office space or something like that? But from a survey of ADU owners throughout the state, we know that roughly 2/3 are actually rented on the open market. And of the other third, we know that they are oftentimes offered to friends and family at no cost. And so these are either parents or grandparents or kids who are coming back from college. And so they're supplying a really important part of the overall housing market in California. The average size is pretty small. It's only 600 square feet. California state law allows them to go bigger than that. But what we are finding is they are mostly relatively modest in size. But of course, there are variations depending on where you're at. For example, the city of San Diego actually has ADU regulations that allow multi-story ADUs and multiple ADUs on a lot. And so again, some cities have gone above and beyond what the state has required. But in general, we find that ADUs built in most communities are relatively small and fit into the existing character of the neighborhood. We also know that most ADUs in California so far have been mostly constructed in affluent neighborhoods. The exception here is in the Los Angeles region. We actually see the opposite, where a lot of ADUs are concentrated in areas of higher poverty. And this is likely due to the city's efforts to legalize unpermitted ADUs and bring them up to code. And many times there are communities where you have seen a lot of informal ADUs. And so a lot of those are being brought up to health and safety codes as a result of that city's efforts. We also hear that there's a concern that, are ADUs actually being built by the homeowners? Are they being built by, LLCs or other groups who own single family homes? And our survey shows that they are overwhelmingly built by owner occupants. And that we also see a lot of folks who are likely to, again, not just rent on the open market, but there is some activity when it comes to short-term rentals, but that actually makes up a pretty small number of the overall use of ADUs. We also have some research from other places that shows that even if a homeowner builds an ADU with the intent to list on a short-term rental site, that eventually that rental turns over into longer-term housing at some point in the future. Next slide, please. We also, have tried to think about the challenges and opportunities presented by ADUs. And so I'll run through some of our findings here. We oftentimes talk about ADUs on the policy space as a way for low and middle income homeowners to increase wealth building opportunities, create more value in their home, create cash flow and revenue to supplement their other income. We're not seeing that as much as we would like. And this is indicative of the fact that, I mentioned earlier, ADUs appear to be mostly built in affluent communities. And a lot of this has to do with two things. The first is that the process to build an ADU can still be pretty confusing and time consuming. It is a construction project. It's not something you can just do on the weekend. And so that involves things like finding a contractor, going through the city permitting process, all things that people who have full-time jobs, have families to take care of, they don't necessarily have the time to go through that process. And so low and moderate income homeowners are having more difficulty breaking into the ADU space here. But probably one of the bigger issues is the lack of financing options. This is what we've heard again and again through conversations with homeowners and ADU builders, is that there are basically just a couple ways to finance ADUs today, or that we've seen used to date, which are to use cash savings or to pull out a home equity line of credit, to pull money out of your home, which requires you to have a lot of equity in it. And so that's partly one of the reasons why we believe we see more ADUs built in affluent communities than we do in lower moderate income neighborhoods. And so a lack of financing options is really putting a cap on the potential growth for ADUs in California, but really nationwide. I think we'll probably talk about this in a bit, but there has been some changes at the GSE level to change the standards of what can count for rental income for ADUs to qualify for loans. And I know we have a conversation that we'll have later about some of the changes that FHA is proposing as well. So anyways, I'll go ahead and stop there. I just have a last slide that just says thank you again. Thanks for the opportunity to present some of our work here, and look forward to the conversation. In California, it has been a huge part of our housing supply solution, this proliferation of ADUs. And so it's great to see other states following in our footsteps, and in some cases going even further than we have done. So hopefully we see more of these kinds of policy changes in the future, and we can expand this research nationwide. So thanks for the opportunity, and happy to join the conversation.
Thank you, David, for that helpful table setting for our conversation. Now let me introduce our other panelists. Dan Hardcastle is a policy advisor in the Office of the Secretary at HUD, where he leads the agency's housing innovation portfolio. Prior to his time at HUD, Dan also founded a platform to help homeowners develop ADUs. Andrew Kallick is the policy development lead at Airbnb. Andrew previously ran for Congress to represent Oregon's 4th Congressional District, and also served as the Deputy Policy Director for the New York City Comptroller. And finally, Kelly Morocco is the Director of Affordable Credit and Policy at Freddie Mac, where she has led the development of ADU policies. Prior to her time at Freddie Mac, Kelly was the Manager of Housing and Community Development at the Loudoun County Department of Family Services in Virginia. So thank you all for joining us today. And with that, let's dive into our discussion. Andrew, I want to start with you and hear your response to David's presentation. Based on your work at Airbnb and understanding the needs of homeowners, do his findings resonate with what you're seeing? And is there anything else you want to add about the opportunities ADUs can provide for homeowners, as well as the need to make them more financially feasible?
Absolutely. Thanks, Owen. And thank you, David, for all of your work. We're big fans of the Turner Center at Airbnb. So it's always great to sit on a panel with you. As many of you know, Airbnb started because our founders needed a way to pay their rent. So they literally laid out air mattresses and hope for the best. And so economic empowerment has always been at the core of what we are trying to do at Airbnb. And ADUs, as David alluded to, are very similar for a lot of homeowners across the United States. They serve a multiplicity of purposes, often at the same time. They can be temporary housing for friends and family. They can be long-term rentals for students, like in the university town that I live in. Occasionally, they can be used as short-term rentals as well. And so what's critical is to figure out, how do you unlock the potential of ADUs, and how do you enable more people to use their property to build an ADU? And what we've found in recent years, and there's some great studies that have come out about this, is that limiting what people can do with an ADU limits how people are able to pay to construct one in the first place. So one particular study out of Los Angeles found that restrictions on short-term rentals actually prevent people from building ADUs. On the side of the line without short-term rental restrictions, there were 17% more ADU permit applications than there were on the side of the line with those restrictions. And what that speaks to is that many people see short-term renting as a way to make ADUs pencil for them. But critically, as David also mentioned, that doesn't mean that they are building a ADU solely to be a short-term rental. In fact, we see our hosts go from the short-term rental to the long-term market frequently, and our data shows this. So just last year in the United States, we had 62,000 ADUs on Airbnb that were rented. And of those 62,000, we had far more nights in ADUs rented for fewer than 60 nights a year than for ADUs rented more than 300 nights, which tells us that, again, people are using short-term rentals on a periodic basis for a couple weeks a year or a weekend here and there to help pay off that financing. And we think that's a really important piece of the puzzle when it comes to unlocking what ADUs can mean in America.
Great. And Andrew, sticking with you've also been based in Oregon, I know, an area with severe housing affordability challenges. Can you speak a little bit about the status of ADUs in Oregon and how they can play a role in increasing affordable housing options in the state?
Sure, yeah. I am coming to you from my home office in Eugene, Oregon, Tracktown, USA, where the sun has come out for the first time in months. So this is a good time to visit if you'd like to join us. We've had a lot of reform here in Oregon. It started up Interstate 5 in Portland in the last decade, where a series of reforms have led to an explosion in ADU development, actually up 600% over that time period in terms of applications. And a lot of that reform had to do with the things that David mentioned, reducing fees, eliminating minimum lot sizes, things of that nature. And I think the success story of Portland is really clear. On the other hand, not every city has done the same. We, right here in Eugene, explored making an ADU in our side yard. The permit fees were significant. The parking requirements were still in place at that time. So it is not the same everywhere. But I'll say one more thing about how Oregon is tackling this, which is that at the state level, we have passed a law that effectively eliminates single-family zoning in most large cities in Oregon. And by large in Oregon, we mean any city above 25,000 people. So that means any lot can be a duplex, a triplex, a quad. Any lot can be eligible for an ADU. And I think that kind of leadership from our state has really been instrumental. Doesn't mean that there's not local opposition to that. When I was knocking doors, even in a progressive community like the one I'm in Eugene, I heard lots of homeowners that weren't exactly happy with that sort of gentle density, as it were. So there's plenty of work left to be done, but I think the direction is in the right one, and that most Oregonians and most Americans understand that if we want to solve the housing affordability crisis, you got to build more housing.
Turning to you, Dan, I'm curious to hear about your perspective from HUD. I know expanding access to ADUs has been a priority for all of you. Why do you see improving access to ADU financing specifically as an important issue for the agency? And what are you seeing as some of the really key barriers for homeowners trying to construct an ADU that you're working to address?
Hey, well, thanks, Owen, and to the BPC for hosting this event. We really have been part of an administration-wide effort here at HUD for since day one to really look at the costs for housing that are affecting Americans, and for all the reasons that we heard from David and from Andrew, these are really opportunities in ADUs to both address the needs of homeowners while at the same time creating rental supply, particularly often in neighborhoods where there's not a lot of existing rental opportunity. So last January, we, in collaboration with the White House, hosted a ADU convening that I'm sure many of the folks in the audience, I hope, were able to attend, and we really sought to dive into these issues. And it is everything from, the sort of threshold question of, is the ADU legal here? Yes or no? And if no, do not pass go. But even once getting past that kind of basic issue, still grappling with everything from, permitting challenges to financing challenges. And since that convening last January, we've continued at HUD to meet with cities and nonprofits and lenders, on the West Coast, but across the country, to drill down further on what these challenges are and how we can really unlock the ADU opportunity. I think for HUD, our mission is always going to be to, serve, those most in need. And that means making sure that, low and moderate income homeowners have access to the wealth building opportunities that ADUs create. And, you heard from David that, of course, one of the challenges we're seeing is that so many of these units are being built in more affluent areas, because those are the folks who can tap into the financing, because those are the folks who have the bandwidth in some cases to, be part-time developers in their backyards. And so we've really looked across HUD programs, particularly at our FHA loan programs, to try to identify ways that we can meet the needs of those homeowners with more modest incomes, as well as home buyers. It's important to think about their role here as well, that in being able to purchase a home that already has an ADU, we want to make sure that that opportunity is available to folks on the lower end of the income spectrum as well, so that the addition of an ADU is not creating a property that then becomes unaffordable to those who might most benefit from the wealth building opportunities that the income stream from the ADU can generate. I think one group in particular that has been a focus, for Secretary Fudge has been seniors, and providing opportunities for them to make modifications of all types to their homes, whether that's accessibility modifications or at the most dramatic end, adding ADUs, which of course can provide housing for the seniors themselves, can also be rented out to provide additional income that can allow them to deal with rising property values and taxes and other costs of living. So making sure again that this is something that we're opening up to everyone to be able to build in their backyard, garage, your basement is really critical for us.
Yeah, and I think you were sort of alluding to this, but quite recently, actually, HUD has proposed a set of policy changes for FHA loan programs. Can you just walk us through specifically what those proposals are and what you're aiming to accomplish with those?
Yes, so this is something that was just posted to the FHA drafting table a couple of weeks ago. And so these are not final changes. We're still very much looking for feedback on them. But I think the change that's going to be of most interest to folks here is around the use of projected ADU rental income. We recognize, of course, that the essential logic of ADUs for many homeowners is the knowledge that once the unit is constructed, that it will then provide them with an added source of income that can help them with all of their expenses, including potentially their mortgage payments. And so we also see cases, seniors are again a great example of this, where folks may have the equity in their homes, they may have everything they need to qualify, but they don't have the income to qualify. And so we want to look at this possibility of allowing homeowners to across FHA loan programs to use that projected income in qualifying for the financing itself. This is similar to how FHA programs have treated duplexes, triplexes, fourplexes in the past, and it's extending that logic to the ADU space, recognizing that ADUs are not always used for rental income. We've tried to include some additional safeguards here. We're only allowing 50% of the projected rental income to be utilized in this case, as opposed to 75% in the case of duplexes. And we're also limiting the portion of the homeowner's overall rent income that can come from the ADU rent. But we really see this as something that, we can be transformative here. And it is something that we want to make sure we're getting feedback from all the stakeholders on this call and everyone else in the ADU space, because we recognize that, there are potential challenges when you're talking about extending this kind of financing flexibility into the construction space, given the challenges that can arise with timing of construction. We want to make sure that borrowers can meet their mortgage obligations for our 203K renovation program, even if construction of the ADU takes longer than expected. So this is probably the area where we're most interested in feedback from folks. And so make sure we get the link out to folks after this, but the easiest thing to do is probably just to Google FHA drafting table, and you'll see the proposed ADU mortgage letter right there at the top. The other piece that this mortgage letter includes is some flexibility and guidance for appraisers on how they can estimate the projected rent for ADUs, including in markets that may not have many existing ADUs to use as comps. We recognize that that's something that can be a barrier in new ADU areas, and so this includes guidance for appraisers, how they can use in the absence of ADUs in the immediate vicinity of the unit being added, how they can use other property types to make those rental assessments. So between these two new flexibilities on top of the existing flexibility of our 203K program that allows for appraisers to use the after improved value of the property in calculating construction availability, we think that this will really address some of the key financing challenges that folks have raised as we've again had these conversations around the country.
Kelly, I know your team at Freddie Mac convened a working group to research the market demand for ADUs and where there are gaps in financing opportunities. Can you speak a little bit about that process and what you learned, and what did your research really find regarding the demand for ADUs and what some of those key barriers for financing are?
Absolutely. And thank you so much, Owen, for having me here and being part of the policy panel. Great to be here with y'all today. So yes, Freddie Mac, we spent 15 to 18 months looking at different market intelligence, everything from white papers that our economists had put out to speaking to our lenders who are our clients, speaking to appraisers, speaking to mortgage insurance companies, speaking to other government agencies, mortgage insurance companies I mentioned. Also, we participated on it was 4 or 5 hours FHFA listening sessions where they brought stakeholders from across the country to give us feedback on ADU policy and what was needed. And then to Dan's point, participated and listened in on the White House symposium around ADUs. We looked at the data that we have currently in that space, and we researched other data. In addition, our collateral team looked at zoning changes across the country and the new flexibilities that we were seeing. And with those new flexibilities, the interest in ADUs and expansion of flexibilities there. What we heard loud and clear in all of this work was that there was a need to allow ADUs on multi-units, more than just a single unit property, the use of rental income. And then the third big thing that we heard from the market during this time was to pay off previously constructed ADUs with a no cash out refinance option. And, I think to David and Andrew's point that people use their home equity, they use credit cards, they use their savings. and how can they recoup that through a no cash out refinance? So those were the three big things that we heard in the market. We also, in digging a little deeper, as we are looking at ADUs and them being rental units and potentially first-time home buyers, what was the support of landlord education around this? And we did hear from stakeholders a strong support of landlord education to help support sustainability in home ownership and ability to rent that ADU.
And Kelly, Freddie Mac has also made a series of policy changes to ensure more homeowners can benefit from ADU financing. Can you give us an overview of these changes and the impact you're hoping to see?
Absolutely, thank you. So we rolled out in June of 2022 some of the items to address what we heard in the market based on the data that we had at that time. And when you're working with the GSE, specifically Freddie Mac, we really look at where we are today, where we are comfortable today in allowing additional flexibilities. And with that, we're able to gather data. That doesn't mean that what we did today is all that we're going to do, but it allows us to provide flexibilities, to get additional data, so we can see what else the market wants us to do. So just to let you know, we are always a work in progress and looking to make additional policies and better policies. But we are very happy with where we landed in June of 2022. Previously, Freddie Mac allowed an ADU on a 1-unit dwelling, but it was only in the cases of home possible or where there was a disabled homeowner that had a caregiver. With this expansion, we are allowing ADUs on multi-unit properties. On both 2 and 3 unit properties, we will allow 1 ADU. We will allow the use of rental income under certain circumstances, and also allow the payoff of short-term financing under our choice renovation. So digging a little deeper into this, our requirements for rental income, it has to be a 1-unit owner occupied with 1 ADU, or it can be a purchase or a cash out refinance under certain circumstances. So that would include the ADU must be with zoning or land use regulations that require legal non-conforming or no zoning. The appraisal report must be obtained to support the ADU's marketability, meaning that it is normal and customary in that market for an ADU, and at least one of the comparable sales with an ADU that is rented. Our ACE, which is our automated collateral evaluation, that is not eligible today if you are using ADU rental income, because we need that rental comparison form completed by the appraiser. The appraiser, of course, must complete this rental analysis with a minimum of 3 comparables that support the market rent of the ADU, and at least one of the comparables has to be an ADU. The seller must ensure that the ADU rental income, the seller is our lender, is used to qualify, does not exceed 30% of the total stable monthly income. And at least one borrower must participate in landlord education if they don't have previous experience of at least a year in being a landlord. In addition to this, we already allowed this under the choice renovation, but we called it out very specifically in our policy under choice renovation that you can do a no cash out refinance to pay off previously used short-term debt to build and construct an ADU. You know, you have to have documentation that proves the funds were used for that, but we will allow that under our choice renovation. And that's a synopsis of everything that we've done. Now we are gathering data. And just to give you a little bit of market intel, so that went out in June. And when we usually start seeing loans come in about 90 to 120 days after we release a new flexibility, because it takes the market, they've got to understand it, we've got to train them. They have to roll it out to their folks, they have to do their marketing, their education with their loan officers. So it takes some time before we start seeing the results, but we are starting to see the loans come in. That gives us data so that we can understand, you know, where these loans are, you know, what is the borrower, what's the performance, so that we can continuously study this. Thank you.
Thank you. I want to remind all the everyone in the audience to feel free to submit your questions in the YouTube chat. But I also want to open up the panel to talk about federal policy solutions. So is there anything that the federal government, whether at FHFA or in Congress, is doing or should be doing that we should be discussing to support ADU financing and construction? I know, David, you mentioned the FHFA changes. I don't know if you want to speak to those.
Yeah, I can just say, you know, huge kudos to Kelly and Dan, all the work that they are doing to think creatively about how to find financing solutions for ADUs. I think then the direction from the administration has been really key to this as well. I mean, not to belabor the point, but you know, this access to these renovation products is really the key to, or one of the keys to scaling ADU growth beyond just the folks who have, you know, some cash savings lying around and a lot of equity in their home. This is, again, really important for us when we talk about ADUs as a tool for wealth building, because right now it doesn't seem like it's getting to that point yet when it comes to the construction of new ADUs and the ability to access these kinds of loan products. So that's all great, and hopefully, as these products are reformed and rolled out, we'll start to get more data, to Kelly's point, on performance, and so we can continue to scale up and make it even more accessible once we prove that, you know, ADUs are something that we can make loans on and do well doing that. On the policy side, you know, I think there's a couple things that are worth considering. One thing I will mention is, you know, there was this $80 million tucked into the omnibus spending bill last year that will go towards facilitating pro-housing policies at the local level. I think part of that could focus on local efforts to catalyze more ADU growth. So I don't know what those regulations will look like, but I think it would be a good idea to think about incentivizing more localities to think about how do they create more ADUs through their own local policies with the support of some of this funding coming from the federal government. So anyways, I'll go ahead and stop there. So I'm sure my colleagues have other ideas too.
I can speak a bit to David's last point about the program that's lives here at HUD which we're tentatively referring to these days as CDBG Pro Housing. But you know, it's a tool that's designed to, you know, reward jurisdictions that have, you know, started to make the right moves on zoning and land use, and just demonstrating that they are indeed pro-housing jurisdictions, as well as helping them, you know, navigate some of the planning processes and other things that are involved in getting those kind of policy changes over the local finish line. You know, I think ADUs are indeed a great example of the kind of local initiative that we've seen bubble up. You know, I think there does seem to be a sense that, you know, they're a lower barrier to entry for some communities in terms of zoning changes, because they're less disruptive to the existing built environment. You know, they do seem to just attract some less pushback. And then you also see, I think, one of the really interesting phenomenons with, local ADU pushes is that, it tends to, I think, disrupt a lot of the typical NIMBY balance because you do have more voices that are stepping forth and are speaking to the fact that, I want to build an ADU in my backyard because, I want to be able to house my aging parents. I want to be able to, tap into that rental income stream. And so, I've seen firsthand in the DC area as jurisdictions around here have begun to move forward on ADU policy changes that those voices do tend to come out. And so I think that as we at the national level, look at how we can help support communities in making pro-housing decisions, that, the example that ADUs provide is really an interesting one for us.
So as David sort of mentioned in his presentation, ADUs are not just a tool to increase the supply of affordable homes, but they're also supposed to, or ideally would help homeowners afford the housing costs they have or build wealth, particularly low and middle income housing owners, but that's not maybe happening as much as we see. I'm curious if anyone has any thoughts about the steps we need to take to make sure ADUs are helping low and middle income homeowners of color and particularly to help close the racial wealth gap.
So I think, some of the most successful ADU pilots that we've seen as we've talked to folks around the country have been those that, provide the additional level of service for homeowners to help them navigate the permitting and construction process, whether they refer to as a concierge model or simply just an enhanced, one-stop shop permitting approach. I think that these are something that really is critical for folks, across income levels, but particularly for those who may be time constrained by their day jobs to, be able to tap into the ADU opportunity. And so, we love to see communities that are rolling out these efforts, especially when they're doing it in a thoughtful way that recognizes, racial and economic gaps. At the same time, on the financing side, recognizing that there is this need for additional financial support. I think efforts like what Cal HFA is doing, providing grants for homeowners for pre-development costs. I think those can be really, really critical in closing the gap and bringing access to more folks. And so, on top of changes to, loan programs that we've talked about today, I think that those sort of, direct grant efforts can really be critical here as well.
Oh, and I mentioned earlier how many Airbnb hosts rely on that short-term rental stream to pay off their mortgage, pay their rent, certainly pay the cost of the ADU. But of course, that assumes that they have financing in the first place to build the ADU. And I think that there's opportunities that we can collectively think through to think about how you integrate prospective short-term rental income into the financing process in the first place. Back about 5 years now, Airbnb partnered with Fannie and several of the nation's largest mortgage brokers to enable people who are seeking refinances of single-family homes to incorporate short-term rental income into those applications. Obviously, this is a much different circumstance, but I think the principle remains the same, that if you're trying to close the racial wealth gap, or any wealth gap for that matter, you have to bear in mind that the folks that you're trying to help don't have a pile of capital to rely on, and therefore you have to think creatively about how to unlock the potential that is in that wealth that they might have in the form of their home or their property. So certainly something that we've been interested in the past and will continue to work on in the future.
One last thing to build on this topic, and it kind of builds off what Dan had mentioned, but we have seen a lot of success at the local level with when you have kind of a third party community organization that can really take the homeowner through, again, the very, despite state law, very complicated effort to construct a new home. And I think a lot of times these community organizations are already steeped in the neighborhoods that they do this work in. So there's a level of trust involved, and allows them to play kind of the conduit between the local agency and the homeowner themselves, and then I'll further connect them to general contractors or architects or whomever you need to bring in to complete this project. So that's been really a really, I think, important targeted effort to specifically try and get low-income BIPOC homeowners access to the ADU market. We've also seen some really creative ways in which local agencies are trying to use things like vouchers to incentivize homeowners to create ADUs, so providing them financing options in exchange for a guarantee to rent the unit to a voucher holder for a number of years. So that has shown some promise and some interest. I think the challenge is, that is not necessarily a scalable model for a number of reasons, but it is an interesting way in which localities are trying to think creatively about providing ADU financing opportunities to homeowners who would otherwise not have that, but also connect it to the housing supply issue and connecting them with voucher holders.
That's a great segue to what my next question, which was going to be beyond the federal government. What is the role of local stakeholders in expanding access to ADUs? So I'm curious if anyone else has any other thoughts about the role of the private sector or philanthropies or nonprofits and community-based organizations, as well as local governments, to work together to do anything to help the financing and constructing and building of more ADUs.
I do have just one plug here. I think it's sort of relevant to this topic, and that is we have a research team at Freddie Mac that, now that we have rolled out our flexibilities, we're seeing what else is needed. And we do want to talk to local jurisdictions, local government officials, stakeholders, nonprofits. So everyone on this panel, I will be giving your name to our research team, and anyone else that would like to participate would be happy to bring in some feedback to our research. So we may have more intel for you after we complete that.
Look forward to hearing from your team, Kelly. And I appreciate the way you asked this question, which I think indicates that there's not one solution out there. Like so much in the housing space, this is an incredibly complicated problem, and it's going to require a lot of different stakeholders to do their part. I think we're already seeing a lot of innovation in the short-term rental space, not just in terms of ADUs, but in terms of home ownership. This is a private sector company called Loftium that has a sort of host to own model where you want to own a home, you actually end up sharing a spare room in that home for 3 years, build up a down payment, and that's used to purchase the home at a pre-existing price. We've actually had other developers come to us, including affordable housing developers, saying, we'd love to build a new building. We'd love to cross-subsidize our deeply affordable units with short-term rental units. Can you help? Sometimes the answer is yes. Sometimes the answer is no because of local restrictions. And that goes back to what I mentioned at the top, which is that part of the solution is not to get in the way of how people finance ADUs and other housing units, but instead to enable them to access the short-term rental marketplace, even if it's just temporarily, to help projects pencil out. And then I'll finish by saying that even one of Airbnb's founders, Joe Gebbia, has started a company that is focused on prefab ADUs, driving the cost down, trying to make them as flexible and attainable as possible for people. So this is certainly something where we've seen lots of innovation. I think we'll continue to see that. And I think that's important because there's no single solution here.
I think this really is, maybe it's just the backyard nature of ADUs that, tend to lend themselves to locally driven policy development. But so much of what we've learned at HUD and across the administration about, both the needs and the opportunities in the ADU space really have come from these kind of local efforts. And so I think, whether it's local financing pilots that have used some of the flexibilities that we're now proposing to deploy more broadly across FHA programs, or whether it's many of our HUD housing counseling agencies, particularly on the West Coast and California, that have really recognized how many of the population that they serve have been coming to them with questions about navigating the ADU process, that have in turn led us to try to cross-pollinate those ideas and those best practices across our housing counselors. So much of this is driven by this local groundswell that we at HUD are trying to help support and bring from the communities that have already led the way on the West Coast to those elsewhere in the country that are newer to the ADU bandwagon.
So we've seen a lot of creative thinking at the local level. Everything from creating pre-approved plans, so you can essentially walk into the planning department and say, I want an ADU, and they say, here, pick from this catalog, and it's approved, to actually dedicating staff specifically for ADU permitting, to really be a go between the city and the process and that homeowner themselves. And so in places where the cities have been very proactive in thinking about creating process or administrative streamlining changes, we see a lot of ADU uptake follow. I mean, we've also had a lot of cities go above and beyond what the state has required. I mentioned San Diego earlier, but they actually have taken the ADU concept and have completely turbocharged it, where you can actually, in certain areas of the city, build unlimited ADUs in exchange for deed restricting a portion of those ADUs. And so we've actually observed some projects where you have 5 or 6 quote ADUs on a site, and you've created basically kind of a missing middle cottage community out of these ADU programs. And so that has been really interesting to see there. So I feel like there's just a lot happening at the local level that is it's kind of a laboratory of ADU policy, and it'll be interesting to see if there is any good ideas coming out of these local planning departments that should be scaled to different places.
One thing that struck me from David's presentation is that it seems like part of the issue is that these are new and an unfamiliar housing option for homeowners. And one barrier to the construction and financing is that a lot of homeowners simply just don't know what is available, or whether they can have one on their property, or how to get approval and construction started. So I'm curious, how important is engaging and educating homeowners about these opportunities?
And I'd like to take that even further back a little bit from Freddie Mac's perspective. It's educating the lenders on what's available for financing. It's educating the appraisers on how you appraise an ADU. And then absolutely homebuyer education, landlord education, marketing. All of those are critical and essential. What we have done so far in Freddie Mac, we have a training for all of our lenders that they can access, so that they know exactly what our regulations are. We also have fact sheets. We have marketing materials for them on our resource page. And then we are starting a new marketing campaign this year. So that's how we're getting the information out to our clients, which are the lenders. In addition to that, our collateral team is partnering with the Appraisal Institute, because what you will find is that appraisers oftentimes are challenged by, is this an ADU or is this a 2-unit? Especially when you're talking a 2-unit with an ADU or a 3-unit with an ADU, what is, what's the line there? And so having that education, both for our lenders, for our appraisers, and then bringing more marketing out to the homeowners is critical, in order for us to make a bigger impact. So we're trying to hit it at all the different places that you need to tap to really make an impact.
I mentioned the role that we've seen HUD Housing Counselors start to play in providing this kind of guidance, and it's really something that we're looking to support, and again, increase opportunities for cross-pollination across our HUD Housing Counseling agencies. I think also working with housing finance agencies and others who are really trying to make these connections to individuals to just make sure that they understand the full suite of what's available here. I think one of the opportunities that we've seen come along is with HUD code manufactured housing, particularly in California, which folks have been utilizing as a lower cost form of ADUs, and that have their own unique set of consumer education needs that our housing counselors have been on top of spreading the word about and talking about the opportunities there. So I think everything with ADUs is about that last mile of education that you are, as Kelly said, it's about at the homeowner level, at the community level. Again, this is a locally driven solution, that's percolated, down, made its way down the West Coast, and now, is making its way to the rest of the country. And so, we want to think about how we can facilitate that.
Great. I want to take the opportunity to address a couple of these audience questions we're getting. We have one from the Casita Coalition, and they said they are excited about the opportunity. They're going to provide some feedback to FHFA's recent update. And one of their priority comments was that they were going to request that detached ADUs be included as eligible as a new construction type. And they were curious if any of our panelists had a thought about that.
Yeah, so I'll just say on that, that is certainly something that we recognize the importance of. It's statutorily, our 203K renovation program can only be used for existing structures on a property. So it can be used for garage or basement conversions, or renovations to an existing ADU. It cannot be used to create a new detached unit. There are a number of proposals, in Congress, and it's something that was included in the president's budget proposal both last year and this year to make that change. But that is something that would require congressional action for us to be able to do.
And as far as Freddie Mac and our choice renovation offering, we do allow the renovation of an ADU or the construction of a new ADU under certain circumstances. So a little bit different than HUD's regulation from Freddie Mac.
We also have a question specifically for you, Dan. In addition to the 50% limit on projected rental income, do the grants that you're talking about have any specific restrictions on the income of the tenant or the term of the rental period?
So just to clarify, this is a loan program, not a grant program. But no, there are not otherwise restrictions on who occupies these units. This is, again, we look to our existing policies around duplexes, triplexes, and fourplexes, and crafting these ADU provisions. And so this largely mirrors what we've done there.
Great. Well, unfortunately, that is all the time we have. I want to thank you to our guests for taking the time out of their very busy schedules to chat with us. For anyone who is interested in all things housing, I also want to take this opportunity to plug the Terwilliger Center's annual in-person housing summit on June 22nd in Washington, D.C. We will be convening some key members of Congress, some top administration officials, and some of the nation's premier housing policy experts. So I definitely recommend joining, and you can find the link to register in the YouTube description or on our website. So thank you so much to everyone who tuned in today, for everyone on our panel, and take care.
Thank you.